Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for our conversation with Dr. Hollis Scarborough. My name's Colleen Pollitt. I'm part of the University of Florida Literacy Institute team. The UFly team is honored to be hosting tonight's webinar. I want to say happy first anniversary to the Science of Reading, What I Should Have Learned in College Facebook community. What a milestone. I just have a few logistics to share before we get started. So first, we do have closed captioning offered this evening. If you are on a computer, you should see a CC icon at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that to turn the captions on or off. And if you're joining us by phone, that option should be available in your app settings. Next, the chat is open, so please use that to engage with each other throughout this session. You can send messages just to our panel or to the entire audience, whichever you prefer. I see some of us saying hi, letting us know where you're listening in from, so thank you. If you have questions for Dr. Scarborough tonight, please put those in the Q&A box. We do have a series of questions that were submitted in advance, ready to ask, but we would like to try to save a couple minutes at the end to ask some questions from the audience this evening. We can't guarantee we'll get to everybody, but we will do our best. That's it for housekeeping. I would now like to introduce Dr. Holly Lane. Dr. Lane is a professor of special education at the University of Florida and is the director of the University of Florida Literacy Institute. Welcome, Dr. Lane.
Thanks, Colleen, and welcome everyone. Everyone at UFly is very excited and honored to host this exciting event. First, we want to recognize the occasion, the first birthday of my favorite non-UFly Facebook group, the Science of Reading, What I Should Have Learned in College. I have to admit that as a college professor who teaches teachers to teach reading, when I first stumbled across the group, I was a little taken aback by the name, but I've come to realize just how many teachers feel unprepared to do their most important job, teaching reading. Given that the page now has well over 40,000 members, that feeling is apparently quite common. And the service that this page is providing is incredible. Teachers and children everywhere are benefiting. So Donna and her crew have done an amazing job creating and sustaining the page. And on behalf of UFly and all the grateful members of the group, I want to wish you a very happy birthday. When Donna announced that Hollis Scarborough would be the guest of honor at this celebration, I jumped at the chance to provide the venue. I've been a huge fan of Hollis's for many, many years. And in fact, when I had just finished grad school and was still just a baby professor doing one of my first national conferences, I was a little blown away by the fact that Hollis Scarborough offered to pass out my handouts for me. So I still remember that. It's been almost 20 years and it made an impression. That's how much I've been a fan. But it is now my honor to introduce the person responsible for the Science of Reading, What I Should Have Learned in College, Donna Heidt-Manick. Donna, you're on mute.
Sorry. There we go. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Lane, for providing us tonight with your Zoom platform and your talented team to help. You are all doing amazing work for teachers and for promoting the science of reading. Today is a very special day for me because 1 year ago, I discovered that Facebook had these things called groups and people joined them to learn and to share ideas. I never even knew about groups and the idea intrigued me. I thought, what the heck? Let's get our message out there. And so on August 14th of 2019, the Science of Reading, What I Should Have Learned in College was created. Watching this page grow to the size it is today has been both inspiring and challenging. However, my mission has not changed. We are here to inform those new and old to the science of reading on how to apply research to practice. I want to thank my 9 moderators that have helped this page grow and shared in the responsibilities. They are Scott Geisler, Lori Josephson, Lisa Plemons, Anika Perrin-Sedano, Jeannie Shop, Christina Lee, Amy McGovern, Dr. Pam Kastner, and Jackie Bainey. I also want to share that our group has influenced so many others to start Facebook groups of their own that continue to influence the world of literacy. Dr. Stephanie Staller created the Facebook group Training Reading Rocket Scientists, and its mission is to help professors promote the science of reading for pre-service teachers. We also have David Pelk, Michigan Science of Reading, What I Should Have Learned in College Facebook page, and we have others. The Science of Reading for Administrators, What Teachers Want You to Know, the Science of Reading for Kindergarten and First Grade, and various other states, including Wisconsin and Alabama. We have a long way to go to turn the ship around, but slowly we can and we will with determination and hard work. Finally, I want to thank the members of this group that read and post, give their insights and expertise, and make this virtual community a place to come to for support and advice. Now, for this evening's event, many questions were submitted for Dr. Scarborough, but due to our time constraints, we had to limit our questions. Dr. Scarborough will only be available tonight by audio, so we will have her picture on each slide. In planning for tonight's event, I asked Dr. Scarborough to share her curriculum vitae with me. She said she was sparing me the long version, but I need to tell you that the abbreviated version is 3 pages long. There is nothing brief about Dr. Scarborough's esteemed career. Dr. Scarborough received her PhD in 1976 in psychology from New York University. From 1979 to 2012, she was the principal investigator or project leader for numerous research projects funded by the National Institutes of Health, the U.S. Department of Education, and the March of Dimes. In 1996, she served as a senior research scientist at Haskins Laboratories. From 2005 to 2011, Dr. Scarborough served as the research scientist at the Learning Disabilities Research Center in Baltimore, Maryland. From 1990 to 2007, she was the lecturer in the psychology department at Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania. Dr. Scarborough served on the board of directors for the Society of Scientific Study from 1999 to 2008, and the Scientific Advisory Board for the International Dyslexia Association since 2005. In addition, she has served on various editorial boards and has presented at various workshops and professional development events. She has published more than 60 publications on reading and reading differences. Dr. Scarborough has received numerous awards, including the Samuel Torrey Orton Award from the International Dyslexia Association, and the inaugural recipient of the Hollis Scarborough Award from the AIM Institute, just to name a few. However, Dr. Scarborough's most well-known work is her creation of the reading rope, which has been untangled, untwisted, and unraveled in workshops and trainings around the world. We are incredibly honored that Dr. Scarborough agreed to be part of our celebration tonight. And without further ado, I present to you Dr. Hollis Scarborough.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Donna.
Thank you.
And thank you to the whole hosting team for making it all so easy tech-wise. And thanks to all the Science of Reading members for inviting me and coming out to listen in the evening. I do apologize for the lack of video at my end. It's a long story. We won't go into it. Before we get down to business, I just want to underscore a few things that are like a subtext to what Donna was talking about. First of all, I'm a developmental psychologist. I don't have any degrees in education or anything like that. And all that really means is that I'm interested in or even passionate about how things change over time. And for me, the focus has been on developmental changes in language and reading, including both the typical case and the atypical case, the development of those things. And we're going from toddlerhood to adulthood and everything in between. Virtually everything I've ever done professionally has a developmental focus. And if you think about it, that's not true for a lot of reading research. So it's going to be a little different. Second, I'm a researcher. I love that. But I've discovered over the years that being a researcher is something of a mystery to people who aren't researchers. So I decided to spend a few sentences describing what that job was to me. It's different for everyone, I'm sure. So what I was supposed to do is come up with interesting questions and then figure out rigorous methods to get legitimate answers to those questions, and then persuade people in Washington and elsewhere to give me funding to carry studies out, and then of course finally to disseminate the results. And I've been pretty successful at that. But it's a good thing I had a husband with a more steady, income stream. So aside from the sheer joy of doing the science, I've also loved being a researcher because of the community of scholars aspect to it. I worked with so many incredible, fabulous colleagues and students from all over the world, and especially from my main research home base, which is Haskins Labs. And finally, I don't know, and the internet may crash over this, I have never taught reading to anybody. And I am pretty clueless about curriculum and instruction stuff in general, which is why I have such tremendous admiration for people who know that stuff and can do that stuff. It's really challenging, and I just feel like an ignoramus around you all. So if you're looking for practical advice on teaching, you're not going to be real happy with the bulk of what I'm going to talk about, but I would hope that you would find some other things of interest in what kinds of things we'll be talking about. And the last thing I have to mention is that I've been retired and inactive for a decade, living in Chester County, Pennsylvania, in a senior community with no academic ties to libraries or journals or grad students or statistical software or tech support or anything. I sure miss the old life, but there's no way I could start it up again here. So to sum it up, you are going to be listening to a retired, developmental, research psychologist who studied language and reading and who is woefully ignorant about the teaching of reading, but I'll do my best. Okay, Donna, we can go get on with it.
All right. Okay, Dr. Scarborough, here we go. What inspired you to create the rope? And what were your thoughts and intentions when you first developed the rope? Why a rope, and why the contrast between the braiding and the twisting of the strands?
Well, most people think of the rope as a product in 2001 because that's the year it was published. But what most people don't know is that it was actually conceived and produced much earlier in 1992 and possibly earlier. That's 28 years ago. There are people listening who weren't even born by the time the rope was born. I cannot promise that my memory of those long ago events is entirely accurate. I bet you can't remember 28 years ago with full accuracy either. But here's what I think happened. For most of the 1980s, I had been studying, in a big longitudinal study, the development of preschoolers who were or were not at risk for later reading disabilities due to their family background. Once the data on their school outcomes were beginning to be collected and analyzed, I started to write like crazy and somehow managed to churn out and publish 10 journal articles in the space of the 3 years between 1989 and 1991. All of a sudden, therefore, having just burst on the scene like that, I was suddenly in demand to give talks and workshops, mainly on reading disabilities. And I'm sure you've discovered this in your career, a good handout is always appreciated by an audience, even if only as something to doodle on. So I decided I really had to make a handout. The high science of this is impressing you, I'm sure. So I'm going to, are you okay, Donna? I'm going to,
oh my gosh,
that at some point in your life, you had to write a term paper, and that most of your papers involved summarizing what had been done previously on the topic. And you probably know that that summary is often called a review of the literature, or for short, a lit review. And for a broad topic like reading, by necessity, the lit review is going to be really long and probably pretty boring. So my dilemma in preparing the handout for all these presentations was, there was already a mountain of newish research on reading disabilities and reading in general, because in very recent decades, because the National Institutes of Health had prioritized it for quite a while and given out a lot of grants to study the cognitive and neurological and genetic and developmental aspects of reading disabilities. And having just published all those articles, I kind of knew that entire literature, and it was huge, but it was fresh in my mind. But I always tell my students, restrict your lit review in an oral talk to like 3 sentences, and then follow up later. But it's really boring and really bad showmanship to start with a lit review when you're dealing orally, even though in writing you have to do that. So an oral lit review is just not an option for my audience. But a visual metaphor can do just as well. The audience I anticipated and was largely teachers and parents who had never read a stack of journal articles, but were passionate about and wanted to understand more about reading disabilities and associated topics. I have no memory whatsoever, I'm so sorry, of the reading rope idea coming into my consciousness. Fireworks did not go off. It was not an inspiration at all. My main emotion, I would imagine, was probably relief at having come up with a decent idea for the handout. All that was left at that point was to decide on the strands, and I had to base that on the lit review in my head and draw it from a model that I made out of pipe cleaners. And that's pretty much how it came into being. A couple of quick notes because I get asked about it. First of all, the rope drawing is my only published artwork, so please do not offer to redraw it for me to make it better. It's not, I don't want to hear it. It's what it is. It's in black and white because it was done in 1992, and that's all there was. At that point, it cost like well over $1 per page to do color copying. The bundle of 3 strands is drawn as a braid because I knew how to draw a braid. And the bundle of 5 had to be drawn as a twist because that was easy to draw, and it would contrast with the braided set when they all merged together at the right-hand side of the rope. There's no deep symbolism, just pragmatics in those aesthetic choices. Why 2 bundles of strands? I can say with 100% certainty that it was not Goff and Tunmer's simple view of reading, which at that point was unknown to me. They had only published 2 brief papers on it in journals, one of which was just starting up and the other which was totally unfamiliar to me. I know that Phil Goff, a brilliant and dear man, will be happy to know he's off the hook for this. Remember, the simple view is a serious, falsifiable scientific theory with excellent empirical support from serious research, rigorous research that set out to test the theory. It bears only a superficial resemblance to the rope, in my opinion. For my classes, in fact, I created a very different graphic to illustrate the simple view, and it just never occurred to me that it had any relationship to the rope. For me, but possibly not for you, the best feature of the rope is its emphasis on change over time in the nature of the relationships among the developing strands and bundles. That is not at all a concern of the simple view, which pertains primarily to what's happening at one point in time. One reason for the 2 bundles was kind of a no-brainer. It was conventional for a long time to make that distinction between, top-down and bottom-up routes for information processing in cognitive lingo. This was widespread in cognitive studies of reading at the time, even before the simple view, and it was emphasized in my graduate training as a cognitive developmental psychologist. Anything else, like 3 bundles, would have been controversial, frankly, radical indeed. But the main reason I wanted to make 2 bundles and have them interact this way was to avoid a reenactment of the so-called reading wars in my audience. These reading wars were raging back then, as you probably know. And this may sound odd because if you know me, you know most of my best friends are on one side of those wars. But I saw merit on both sides of the wars, and that's a natural offshoot of my work in preschool language and literacy, because there wasn't a whole lot of print going on in what the preschoolers were doing at age 2 and 3 and 4. So I was very concerned at that point with the upper strands and saw them as very legitimate. And indeed, even though the feuding factions in the reading wars disagreed as to which bundle was more important, they actually agreed that every strand in the rope plays some role. There has never been a reenactment of the reading wars in any audience that I've had the pleasure to address. So in sum, the rope is a lit review, maybe a lit review that's gotten a little too big for its britches. The visual metaphor, and it is a visual metaphor, emphasizes developmental change more than most models, but there's no formal, testable theory lurking in the figure. The rope was and is a straightforward handout for non-researchers, and its best function, in my eyes, is as a basis for clear communication. It allowed my audiences and I to talk about a familiar, concrete thing, a rope made of strands, as a metaphor for what research had been shown to be important for becoming a good reader. Jargon can be so intimidating to novices, and I like to avoid it at all costs, and the visual metaphor allowed me to do that. To this day, though, the takeaways that I would end with or emphasize in talking about the rope is the same as they were in 1992. Reading is complicated. All strands are developing over time. As they develop, the strands and bundles interact, they influence each other. Being strong on the lower strands affords more opportunities to acquire more knowledge of the upper strands, and being strong on the upper strands has been shown to enable faster and more accurate decoding of unfamiliar words. Therefore, if any of the strands gets frayed, it can hold back the development of other strands, and by extension, can eventually weaken the entire rope. Hence, reading difficulties can potentially stem from different sources originally, but the diagnostic profile can widen so that all aspects of reading can appear to be impaired. So, why did I finally publish it in 2001? Well, after the handout containing the rope had been circulating for all those years, my friend Linnea Erie, who's also a friend of some of you, came back from a conference, I think it was probably AERA, around the year 2000 or 1999. And she called me up immediately to say, Hollis, I went to a talk and this lovely young person put up your reading rope and said, here's Dr. So-and-so's reading rope, not me. And so she yelled at me and said, you must publish that thing right away. And as luck would have it, I was almost done writing a chapter for the Newman and Dickinson volume, and a little sneaky maybe, but I slipped the rope drawing in at the beginning as part of the introduction and wrote an entire 3 paragraphs about it, because it really didn't have that much to do with the rest of the paper. And that there is proof that the rope is just a handout. I've never written any papers about it, just those 3 hasty paragraphs. So, you know, it's weird. It's a weird part of my career because it's not one of those papers that I produce. There's no citation except for the chapter. So that's the story of where it came from and why it came from and how unromantic a story it is.
But so fascinating, incredibly fascinating. Thank you so much for that. I know now. All right, on to the next. Do you have an updated infographic in the works? And would you change anything about the rope? And is there any recent research that suggests adding or deleting any strands?
Well, at this point, I prefer to treat the rope as a historic document. I'm in no position to do anything about reworking it or posting about that. Other people presumably will at some point. Obviously, some of the terminology is outdated a little, and that bothers some people a lot more than it bothers me. But for its intended purpose of, being a handout to introduce non-research oriented parents and teachers to the complexities and development of reading, the rope still does a pretty good job. If it didn't, it would have been gone long ago and you wouldn't be here. So you probably don't realize that I get 2 or 3 requests every week from people seeking to reproduce the rope in their presentations of various sorts, usually professional development and peer sharing situations for teachers. And my permission is contingent on only 2 things. You can't make any substantive changes, and you must cite the 2001 chapter. But I'm sad to report that a handful of people, a handful that I know of, have gotten the itch to revise the rope, not just reproduce it. And this irks me, especially when they attach the words Scarborough's rope to what they have done. My impression of these creators is that most of them are pretty smart people, but they're not interested in using the rope for its humble intended purpose. They tend, and I say that not because I've met any of them, I haven't, but they tend to add jargon and complications and things that muddy the message, whereas my goal is to be as clear as possible. And their intended audience, which is usually people who follow their blogs, seems, at least to me, to be fairly sophisticated about the science of reading. And yet, these revisions appear to miss key points of the original rope with respect to content as well as purpose. And sometimes I feel that there's a hidden agenda there in things they don't like about the rope being actually tracing back to some reading war contention. Mm-hmm. To those creative revisionists, I would like to say, and at some point I probably, as I meet them, will, as in all academic discourse, the burden is on you to first provide a well-reasoned critique of the rope and to make evidence-based persuasive arguments about how it needs to change to better achieve its aims. Not your aims, its aims. From what I've seen, the changes that people propose are often not at all well suited to a rope metaphor. And they'd be better off, really, for their own sake, devising their own visual metaphors. If you're not into the developmental part, find a better static model of some sort. If you like development, but not the way I conceive of it, find a better image. If you like to break up continuous development into stages or phases, use stairs or steps or a ladder. If you want to add complications of strands going off on, shoots and coming back and turning around and doing feedback loops, then go with a tree or a vine or something that will give you the freedom to use, different numbers of pieces at any point. Remember, a rope is very rigid and simple. It has the same number of strands at the beginning that it had at the end, with the possible exception of a macrame product. Okay, so now let me, after that little rant or digression, whatever you want to call it, let me turn to the heart of the question. What changes, if any, should be made to that rope, especially changes that would reflect more recent research findings? One change I really would love to see is a regret that when and I don't know how it happened, when the original handout rope went to production in the published, they stripped off the bottom where there was a horizontal arrow going left to right labeled time. Okay. And I feel that I would like to see that back. And I often add it back myself because it reminds people that this is developmental and just a pretty design. I would say the thing that happens most often in terms of suggestions is that people would really like me to add fluency as a strand unto itself. And indeed, there is a great deal more research now on fluency than there was when the rope was devised. But in my view, the empirical evidence generally supports the opposite view. that fluency is a consequence of becoming skilled at something.
Mm-hmm.
As you get better at over time, you can do X faster, in a more automatized way, in a less deliberative manner, like the acquisition of a golf swing or knitting or driving. There's lots and lots of examples of fluency following skill. Right before COVID, I heard a talk by Mark Seidenberg, and I was ecstatic to hear him make this same point about fluency, which is something we had never discussed. And I know that Mark and I are not the only folks in the world who have drawn this conclusion from the available research. But for reasons that I'm just not sure of, people are fixated on fluency as a thing. And I don't think that's a valuable change to the rope, although it has been proposed a lot. Another proposed change has to do with an aspect of oral language that was not much studied in relation to reading in 1992, and that's morphology. Now, I studied psycholinguistics a lot in grad school, so I was, very sympathetic to it, but there wasn't much research on morphology in relation to reading at that point. I'm pretty sure that if you wanted to add morphology as itself, you would have to add two strands, because you would have to differentiate inflectional from derivational morphology. I don't think they show the same developmental trends at all. So instead of adding two strands, I would prefer to subsume inflectional morphology under language structures, especially syntax, and derivational morphology under probably vocabulary. Other suggestions focus on the bottom strands and especially their labels. Many of you are too young to have noticed, but the various terms, word identification, word recognition, decoding, sight recognition, things like irregular word recognition, things like that have changed fairly often over the years. The ones from 1992 are fortunately still comprehensible to most of us, just a little outdated, a little generic. Debates about the terminology and modeling of the bottom strands hold little fascination for me. I'm more of a preschool and later person. And more important, I think, is to remember that the rope is a handout and that getting into the subtle nuances of differences between various routes to getting to words and back down, that's just going to confuse the heck out of the novices that I'm hoping to help with the rope. But I know that some people will be very disappointed to hear me say that. Other proposed add-ons always include motivation, executive functions, attention, focus, memory capacity, social emotional control, poverty, school quality, safe and quiet learning environments, health, etc., etc. These and others are indeed very, very strong influences on academic learning, but not specifically on reading. They affect everything. And that's why they're not in the rope. It's a rope for reading, and you have to embed it in that larger context that includes all of those other things. And finally, please note that I have no objection to those of you who feel very strongly about some of these things that I'm not being terribly sympathetic to, that if and when you use the rope, you could annotate it by putting in the margin, like if you prefer alphabetics, like in the National Reading Panel or something, to word recognition, then put alphabetics in the margin with an arrow to word recognition and say, I prefer, or something like that. Or write including morphology with arrows to the relevant strands. That's intellectually honest, allows you to display your own views without destroying the original. And, I heartily approve putting out your views alongside mine. But a more substantive change, like taking out your Sharpie and altering the course of a hurricane, no, please don't do that. Nobody did that. Oh. All right, Donna.
Thank you for that. That was fabulous. Thank you for your insight on that. And I'm glad you had a chance to share out your concerns about the rope and interpretations of it and visions other people have. Thank you. On to the next question.
I can add that this summer, my COVID hobby was whack-a-mole, to find all, or as many as I could, people who had put up these bastardizations of the rope and politely write to them. And I must report that in most cases, they have said, oh my gosh, I didn't realize it said it was Scarborough's rope, so I just used it and I wasn't paying attention. And of course, now that I look at it, it's not your rope. I'm really sorry, we're done. You know, it usually went like that. There are only a few hard cases. I don't mean to imply that it's a widespread issue. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, next one. Can you discuss the reading rope with respect to languages other than English and any implications for bilingual programming?
I've been asked hundreds of questions about the rope, but never this one. Isn't that amazing? It is such a good question. I have a suspicion that the person who asked it knows a whole lot more about it than I do, and I would rather listen to them, frankly. Now, obviously, it is a huge topic with so many questions raised by the variability of oral languages and the way they're written down and the way they get combined. I guess it's not surprising, given the complexity of that there's really not very good or robust evidence to base the kind of answers on that you want. So the best answer I should give, and I guess I will, is no, I can't discuss it in the amount of time we have, but it's certainly worthy of discussion. I'm really, really glad it was asked.
Thank you. And I think maybe that might be something we can throw up on our Facebook page for a healthy discussion.
That would be awesome.
Okay, the next one. This is a really good one. Do I have your permission to get a reading rope tattoo?
This is another question I have never before been asked. The creativity, of course, stuns me and impresses me. Being a researcher, of course, I had to collect a little survey data before I could answer it. So I asked my friends what they thought. And unfortunately, my friends and colleagues were not very helpful and maybe a little raunchy. Two of them were focused on where on your body the tattoo would go. And ew. And two raised a bunch of legal copyright issues. But as far as I'm concerned, that would only come into play if you're an exotic dancer, which I suspect you are not. You are probably attending this event. So my research on this topic was a total bust, I must say. I will just take the coward's way out and leave it up to you. Sorry.
Dr. Scarborough, you could do stand-up comedy, I think.
No.
Yeah. All right, next question, please. Besides the reading rope, what other research studies were you involved in that will leave a lasting impact? Tell us about some of your past work that stands out in your mind.
Well, people my age really worry about their legacy, so this really, got me. None of us can really know about which of the things we create will have a lasting impact and which will just fade away like, a fad or something. For academics, a big part of the curriculum vitae, which it's a resume, but that basically means your summary of your life. It's that list of publications that you've produced. That's that, publish or perish center core of evaluating you. The odds are that your publications that are most often cited by other researchers and scholars now are the ones with the best shot at having a lasting impact, but no guarantees. So, and this is me, in order to answer the question, I picked out the 8 papers of mine that have been cited more than 500 times, which makes me very happy. There are 8 of them, and they are quite a mixed bag. One of them introduced a new measure that only the speech language ASHA folks in the room will be familiar with, the Index of Productive Syntax, or IPSYN. IPSYN is a way of scoring syntactic complexity in a preschool recorded language sample, and I designed the measure 30 years ago. Here's a little tidbit. My mentor was Marty Brain, the great language researcher, and the first time I submitted the IPSYN for publication, it got roundly rejected because, in a nutshell, is the only reason. We already had MLU. Who needed anything else? And MLU is mean length of utterance. So I put it in a drawer, and a few years later, but I had presented at a conference and handouts were circulating, and one of them ended up in Marty's hands, and he phoned me up. He was so ticked off, and he said, "So it got turned down by thus and such journal, send it elsewhere." And of course I sent it in and it was accepted as is. So, you know, I was a little timid. I'm not now, but that's the story behind the IPSYN. And now it's one of the top rated, top cited papers that I've ever produced. It's used a lot in language development research and even in clinical practice. Jenny Roberts and Evie Altenberg at Hofstra University continue to study IPSYN's validity and the various make comparisons between machine scoring accuracy and hand scoring accuracy, especially in clinical practice. And in fact, the latest and probably last final addition to my curriculum vitae was a 2018 article by the three of us. But I have to say, in all candor, I'm mainly window dressing. They do all the heavy lifting in our work together. Another of the papers, there are two that were large, heavy lit reviews. One was on the efficacy of reading to preschoolers, which I wrote with the late Wanda Dobrich, my student. It started out as a 15-page heads-up paper to just tell other research, hey, you're going to be surprised at what we found. The evidence is really weak for the widely held belief that literacy development is enhanced when parents read to their preschoolers. Well, after dealing with the dozens and dozens of questions posed by the, I think, 6 reviewers, it turned into a monster 50-page article with a full-blown meta-analysis and a narrative review. People did not like it, and they let me know. Kill the messenger, right? But it's been cited about 1,400 times. We never said that reading to a preschooler doesn't matter. Rather, we said that the data say it doesn't matter all that much. But I really hope that the lasting impact of my work isn't just this one production, because it's just not me. It was just a little 15-pager that turned into a monster. Happens.
That's fascinating. Amazing.
The other lit review.
Okay, sorry.
Pardon me?
I'm sorry.
Okay.
We were done.
Nope, got more. I told you I could go on all night. The other lit review that's widely cited is about early identification of children at risk for reading disability. It's in a book, and it includes a lengthy review and a meta-analysis, but it's all about what kinds of factors have the most power to predict reading proficiency several years into the future. And we look at everything from socioeconomic status to kindergarten test scores to a variety of comorbidities and things like that. As far as I can tell, answering the question, the conclusions are holding up well 20 years after publication. It's a little odd for a lit review, maybe, but it may just be that fewer people are doing longitudinal prediction research nowadays. It's a pretty good chapter. Most people would probably learn something by reading it even today. And of course, you can email me for it. There are 4 data papers in the mix. One is very early language deficits in dyslexic children, which I swear I'm getting a request a week these days for it. It's like it's having a resurgence. The reason that I was doing that longitudinal research that I described before is that up until my work, the prevailing view of dyslexia was that it had this mysterious appeal because, and I'm going to quote from an eminent team of neuroscience researchers who are friends, so I won't name them because they're very embarrassed by having said this. Dyslexia has no well-established developmental precursors in the preschool period. Dyslexic children, for the most part, appear to be normal in infancy and toddlerhood and have problems only when they first begin to have to name letters and learn letter sound correspondences. And, you know, a couple years later, here I was saying, actually, if you look at them when they're 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, it's very clear that the early language development of children who are going to turn out to have dyslexia, regardless of what kind of family background they have, is going to be behind or different from that of the children who will go on to be successful readers. And that study and the results from it has been replicated around the world in 8 different countries. That's probably my most favorite achievement, is to have spurred so much fabulous research. There's a half a dozen other papers around then that come from that big study, but the one that's the most cited is the 1990. And similarly, we picked off from that group the children who had early language delays, which is the formal diagnostic category, and we just followed their development, their language scores and other scores over time from the age of 2. And that's where, if you're in that area, the notion of illusory recovery, that kids can look like they're completely recovering from their early language difficulties and go into a plateau. But then if you follow them out to 2nd grade, boom, back come the language and reading problems. So that was kind of a tying together 2 literatures paper, and it's still quite popular. The late emerging reading disabilities paper by Jen Leach, Leslie Lewis-Gorla, and me in 2003, the title says it all. Up until that point, it was assumed and argued and shown, actually, that if you didn't have problems by grade 3, you were home safe. And we said, and I have to say, teachers instructed me here. I was giving those workshops and stuff, and hands went up and people would say things like, what am I supposed to do with this 5th grader who just showed up at my clinical practice, who has all these really bad reading problems, but his school record is immaculate? And I'm like, how often do you get that? And she's like, a lot. And then I asked the audience, how many of you have encountered this? And like everybody raised their hand, all the speech language people. And so I decided, hey, that's worth investigating, because as far as research psychologists and reading people were concerned, this could not happen. So anyway, that was a paper that got a lot of attention. And finally, the last data paper is by Lori Cutting and me, on 2006, on problems in measuring reading comprehension. And the title gives its main finding. In predicting reading comprehension, the relative contributions of word recognition, language proficiency, and other cognitive skills can depend on how comprehension is measured. In other words, the dependent measure, the thing you're trying to predict. If you use the gray oral, you're going to get, oh, vocabulary matters a lot and syntax doesn't at all, and stuff like that. It's a huge headache, both for researchers and practitioners. Nobody has solved it. It's an unregulated, testing is an unregulated industry. There's no way scientists can influence them. The solution, of course, is to give, and that's what Lori and I always do, is to give multiple reading comprehension tests, but that adds 2 hours to your testing protocol. I mean, that's just insane. All right, finally, a theory chapter entitled Connecting Early Language and Literacy to Later Reading Disabilities. This is the paper that has the reading rope as figure 1, although, as I mentioned before, the paper is not about the rope. I will never know how many people cite the paper because of the rope and how many were interested in all the other really neat stuff in the chapter. Either way, it is nice to be appreciated. So now I'm done with the bio stuff.
Okay, let me make a comment about that. You had sent me some information on some some articles that you had written. Are those articles in that document you sent me, the ones you just talked about?
Yes, because I think I sent you the high-cited ones.
Great.
I don't think the Ibsen is in there because your audience is not going to be interested in a measure for scoring preschool language samples. But other than that, I think they are.
Okay. So to the members, what I will be doing is posting that along with the recording. So you will have some, you'll have a document that you can reference to access these articles. I think that'll be wonderful. I'm so intrigued. I want to start researching right now because that's what we're all about, the science. Okay, next one. Can you please explain your 2005 chapter about the ugly facts? In the past 15 years, has research continued to support the ugly facts such that the chapter's message remains pertinent?
Funny someone would ask that. The ugly facts chapter, which I really like, doesn't get cited very much at all. So I think that's because it's very provocative. It challenges the zeitgeist. And that's why, you know, another kill the messenger maybe, but it just can't keep up with my better known papers. But I like this one a lot. And every time I present it orally, people like it too. For the sake of everyone else here, aside from the questioner, who I believe has read the 2005 chapter, here's the briefest possible summary that I know we're tight on time, that I can give. Okay, that one, leave that one on. I'm going to read you the definition of dyslexia from the IDA website, which reflects what most reading researchers believed and continue to believe about reading disability and dyslexia. Dyslexia, and it's also captured by this drawing here. Dyslexia is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. And even if your work doesn't have much to do with reading disabilities or dyslexia, I suspect that these main ideas probably also influence your thinking, even about non-disabled readers and instruction. It is a splendid theory. It is still a splendid theory. It is strongly associated and has deep roots at Haskins Labs, my research home, and they still love me and let me in the door. So you know it's not a disaster story. But look at the green thing. Oh, it's blue. Okay, look at the blue section there. You know already I'm an ardent developmentalist, and I became aware that almost all the research on this predominant theory comes from studies of K to 3 and mainly first and second graders. That always bothers me because, you know, if you're talking about a disorder that might be lifelong, you really want to look before and after the typical onset period. Next slide, please. So as a developmentalist, I was familiar with research at other age ranges, especially, of course, preschool and older readers, not just by me, but by other researchers. And in that body of research, all along, I had been noticing various anomalies that would be challenging for the core phonological theory to account for. So I collected and organized them, and I began to call them the ugly facts, which comes from the quotation from Thomas Huxley that's on the slide if you could see it. Tragedy in science is the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact. So our beautiful hypothesis is, of course, the phonological core theory of the basis for dyslexia. The problem was when I looked at the preschool literature and I looked at the post-grade 3 literature, I kept running across these ugly facts. And in order to make it into the list that you see, they had to be, each one had to be reported in at least 2 studies by different researchers. And most of them have much more support than that, but that was the minimum. So In the preschool years, and some of these may surprise you, phonological skills are not the only or even the best predictors of reading. When several kindergarten skills have been measured, multiple language measures, not just phonological ones, have predicted future reading. Different language skills predict reading from different preschool ages, which is a little hard for the theory. Prediction is as good or better from the age of 3 or 4 as it is from kindergarten, the age of 5 or 6. That's weird. Number 5, phonological awareness in kindergarten is predicted by prior non-phonological abilities, not by prior speech measures. Number 6, the deficit profiles of preschoolers with language impairments often shift over time. 7, the risk for reading disability remains even if language impairments disappear by the age of 5. That's that illusory recovery thing that Wanda and I wrote a paper on. And finally, for the preschoolers, some kids with language impairment do not develop reading disability, and some who end up having reading disability have no history of language impairment. After grade 3, we have, it is very much lots of evidence about this. Full-blown phonological reading disability can apparently emerge after 3rd grade. I mean, it looks like a classic dyslexia, but it's in a 3rd or 4th or 5th grader. I'm sorry, 4th, 5th, or 6th. Of students with reading disabilities in grades 4 through 8, about half had no prior signs of reading disability, K3, and prior signs includes the mother worrying, the teacher worrying, anything, no referrals, nothing, and good test scores. Number 11, reading comprehension does not necessarily suffer as a secondary consequence of word level reading disability. That has been known in the dyslexia world for a long, long time. Other Matthew effects for reading and IQ are also elusive. And that's, well, people really don't like to give up on the idea of Matthew effects, but I no longer think they hold any water at all. And finally, a surprising proportion of good readers like you and me and, you know, top 10%, do poorly on conventional phonological awareness, phonemic awareness tests, which came as a shock, but there is a wonderful paper called The Fate of Phonemic Awareness After the Primary Grades that is a coordination of myself, Linnea Erie, Dick Olson, and I forget who the 4th person is. I think it was Ann Fowler at the time. The question on the table, of course, is 15 years out, have data accrued that would make the argument less persuasive? Well, first of all, you got to realize everything on the list has been replicated already. So it's unlikely that any data would come along to disprove any of these 13 facts. The question is whether there might be other findings that would allow a reinterpretation of some of them, but there's an awful lot here that just doesn't match. So I'm pretty sure, I'm not as up to date on the most recent research as I should be, but I don't think anything has happened. No need to panic though. You'll be relieved to know that I never said and would never say that we have to slay the beautiful hypothesis. It's still beautiful. But in the chapter I argued that the phonological model isn't wrong, just incomplete. But, and this is mean of me, you're going to have to read the chapter yourself to ponder the several alternative models that embed the phonological core theory into a larger developmental theory. I will mention that the word syphilis does occur in that. Okay. Done.
Thank you. Amazing. All right, our final question. How can teachers best ensure that they are addressing all aspects of the reading rope in building confident readers? And as practitioners, we often home in on decoding deficiency or struggle with morphology. What can we do to ensure we are connecting with all of the elements of the rope?
Well, Donna, this is where my ignorance is going to be revealed. You can just pull back that curtain.
Okay.
I think, first of all, I like that the person who created this question is doing a sort of meta-analyzing of his or her professional practice.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think we should all pull back and do a little self-study occasionally to see where we're missing connections. I would ask the person though, and I talked to somebody that you all know yesterday about this. So Marilyn Adams is on board with this. I want to ask you, and perhaps this is another item for group discussion on the site, don't you find that covering all the bases, making all the connections, the cross connections between the strands comes pretty naturally, at least at the elementary level? I mean, isn't it hard to avoid cross-cutting influences? If you're zoned in on one strand and that opportunity arises to tie it to something else in a previous lesson or in the classroom or whatever, of course you can do that. That's not going to happen every minute, of course, but it'll happen often enough to facilitate the cross-thinking. Mm-hmm. And your students, it seems to me, might be giving you feedback about possible missing links that they haven't made, especially if you pay attention to their errors. If your student is clearly missing some critical information from another strand than the one you're addressing or intending to address, obviously you can do something about it to make that connection and fill in that gap in that student's knowledge, and at the same time cross-link from the two strands. Now I realize, and I apologize, that it's kind of unfair to ask you questions without real discussion, and I'm sorry about that. I am positive there are many folks here who could provide answers that you'd find a lot more helpful. So I hope you and all teachers have many opportunities at your job or on the Science of Reading site to ask your fellow professionals questions like this. You'll all probably have a great time discussing these things. The case of special ed might be a little more daunting because I think the cross-referencing of skills and knowledge over different types of lessons is harder in that case. And the discrepancies in skill levels across strands may be more large. But I truly don't know. I have never studied that. Might be interesting to study. Anyway, so we're done. Okay, apologies for saying anything really ridiculous. I've done the best I can. Rescue me, Donna.
Hollis, thank you so much. I'm so glad you gave us this opportunity, that you're not as rusty as you thought you would be. For 10 years out, you're doing fabulous. Wow. We are all in this together, every single one of us, every researcher, every teacher, every parent, every child. Thanks to each one of you for your work helping kids. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. We are all in this together. Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. This was such a wonderful discussion. Thank you, Dr. Scarborough, for all your insights and your humor this evening. Thank you, Dr. Lane, for hosting us tonight. And thank you, Donna, and just congratulations for bringing this community together, making this night happen and making this group and this movement happen. We are so appreciative. So thank you all for joining us from all around the world. Have a wonderful night, and we will see you next time. Bye, everyone.